Right, here's something that's probably going to wind you up a bit. Whilst everyone's been focused on interest rates and mortgage chaos, something else has been happening right under our noses. Councils up and down the country have been quietly changing their property licensing rules. And guess who's picking up the bill at the end of the day? Yeah, you've guessed it, tenants. Now look, I know what some of you might be thinking. Licensing is supposed to protect tenants, isn't it? It's meant to make sure properties are safe and landlords are doing their jobs properly. And yeah, in theory, that's absolutely spot on. But what's actually happening on the ground is a completely different story, and honestly, it's a bit of a mess. So in today's video, we're going to dig into exactly what's going on with these licensing changes. We'll look at which councils are doing what, why they're doing it, and most importantly, how it's affecting real people who are just trying to find somewhere decent to live. Whether you're a tenant, a landlord, or just someone trying to understand this bonkers housing market we've got, stick around because this is stuff you really need to know. And before we crack on, if you find this helpful, do us a favour and hit that subscribe button. We put out videos every week breaking down what's really happening in the UK housing market. No fluff, no nonsense, just straight facts. Right, let's get into it. Okay, so first things first. For those of you who might not know exactly what property licensing is, let me give you a quick rundown because it's actually quite important to understand this before we go any further. So basically, property licensing is a scheme that councils can use to regulate private rental properties in their area. There are three main types you need to know about. First up, you've got mandatory HMO licensing. HMO stands for Houses in Multiple Occupation, and this applies to larger shared properties. If you've got 5 or more people from 2 or more households living together, sharing facilities like kitchens and bathrooms, that property needs a license. This one's been around for ages and it's a national requirement. Then you've got additional licensing. This is where councils can extend HMO licensing to cover smaller shared properties that don't meet the mandatory criteria. So even if you've got 3 or 4 people sharing a house, the council can say that needs a license too. And finally, there's selective licensing. Now this is the big one. This allows councils to require all private rented properties in a specific area to have a license, regardless of whether they're shared or not. So, if you're renting out a normal family home, you might still need to pay for a license. Now here's the thing, these licensing schemes come with fees. We're talking anywhere from £300 to over £1,000, depending on the council and the type of license. And these licenses typically last 5 years, so landlords are basically paying this money regularly. The idea behind all of this is to improve housing standards, tackle antisocial behaviour, and make sure landlords are meeting their responsibilities. Sounds reasonable enough, doesn't it? But here's where it starts getting a bit complicated. Right, so here's what's been happening over the past couple of years, and it's actually quite sneaky when you think about it. Councils across the country have been expanding their licensing schemes, often with very little fanfare. We're talking about consultations that happen over Christmas when nobody's paying attention, announcements buried in council meeting minutes, and changes that affect thousands of properties with barely any public awareness. Let me give you some numbers here because this is quite eye-opening. Back in 2015, there were roughly 30 selective licensing schemes operating across England. Fast forward to 2024, and we've now got well over 150. That's a massive increase, and it shows no signs of slowing down. And it's not just the number of schemes that's growing, the size of these schemes is expanding too. Councils used to apply selective licensing to small targeted areas where there were genuine problems with housing conditions or antisocial behaviour. Now we're seeing borough-wide schemes that cover entire council areas. We're talking tens of thousands of properties suddenly needing licenses. What's particularly frustrating is how these changes are being communicated, or rather, how they're not being communicated. A lot of landlords are finding out about these requirements when it's almost too late, or worse, after they've already missed the deadline. And missing a deadline can mean penalties of up to £30,000 or more. I've spoken to landlords who've owned properties for 20 years and suddenly find out they need a license they never knew about. The councils will say they've done their consultations and sent out letters, but the reality is that loads of people are falling through the cracks. And here's another thing that's changed quietly. The costs have gone up significantly. Some councils have nearly doubled their licensing fees over the past few years, When you combine higher fees with more properties needing licenses, that's a lot of extra money flowing into council coffers. Let me give you some specific examples because I think it's important to see what's actually happening in different parts of the country. Take Newham in East London. They were actually one of the pioneers of licensing, bringing in a borough-wide scheme back in 2013. They've renewed it multiple times since then, and their fees have gone up each time. We're now looking at over £1,000 for a 5-year selective licence in some cases. That's on top of any HMO licensing requirements. Then look at Liverpool. They've got a massive selective licensing scheme covering about 50,000 properties. The scheme's been controversial from the start, with lots of landlords arguing it's more about generating income than improving standards. The council disputes this, obviously, but the fact remains that landlords are paying millions in fees collectively. Birmingham recently introduced additional licensing across the whole city for smaller HMOs. This affects thousands of properties that previously didn't need any license at all. Landlords had to scramble to apply, and many are still working through the backlog. Manchester's got a patchwork of selective licensing areas that keeps expanding. What was once targeted at specific neighbourhoods has grown to cover much larger parts of the city. Leeds has been expanding its licensing too. Same story in Sheffield, Nottingham, and countless other places. And it's not just the big cities. Smaller towns and district councils are getting in on the act as well. Places you might not expect are suddenly introducing licensing schemes, often with tight deadlines and limited awareness campaigns. Right, so this is the crucial bit. How does all of this actually affect tenants? Because that's what this video is really about. The most obvious way is through higher rents. Look, I know some people don't want to hear this, but it's basic economics. When landlords face higher costs, those costs get passed on to tenants. It doesn't happen overnight, but it absolutely happens. A licensing fee might be £1,000 over 5 years, which works out to about £200 a year, but when you add that to all the other costs landlords are facing, higher mortgage rates, energy efficiency requirements, safety certificates, insurance increases, it all adds up. And tenants end up paying for it through higher rents. Now, some people will argue that landlords should just absorb these costs and accept lower profits, and in an ideal world, maybe that would happen. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where landlords are businesses making financial decisions, and if the numbers don't work, they leave the market. And that brings me to the second way tenants are paying the price. Landlords are selling up. The rental market is shrinking at exactly the time when demand is through the roof. Every survey of landlords shows the same thing. More are planning to sell than to buy, and licensing is consistently cited as one of the factors pushing them out. When a landlord sells, that property often leaves the rental market entirely. It might be bought by someone who wants to live there, which is fine for them, but it means one less rental property available. Fewer properties means more competition, which means higher rents and tenants having less choice and less bargaining power. The third impact is reduced quality in some cases. I know this sounds counterintuitive because licensing is supposed to improve quality, but here's the thing. When landlords are stretched financially, when they're paying more fees and facing more regulations, some of them cut corners elsewhere. Maintenance gets delayed, improvements get postponed, the property gradually deteriorates. And there's another issue too. Some landlords simply don't engage with the licensing system. They don't apply, they don't comply, and they operate under the radar. These tend to be the worst landlords anyway, the ones who don't care about regulations, so licensing often ends up catching the decent landlords who try to do things properly, whilst the rogues carry on regardless. I've seen this pattern time and time again. The compliant landlords pay their fees and do everything right. The non-compliant ones continue renting out substandard properties, whilst councils struggle to enforce against them. Tenants in those properties don't see any improvement at all. This brings me to something that really doesn't get talked about enough: enforcement, or the lack of it. See, councils can introduce all the licensing schemes they want, but if they're not properly enforcing them, what's the point? And the evidence suggests that enforcement is patchy at best. A lot of councils don't have the resources to properly inspect all the properties they've licensed. They might issue thousands of licenses, but actually visit a fraction of those properties. Some landlords pay their fee, get their license, and never see an inspector in 5 years. Meanwhile, unlicensed properties often go undetected for years. Councils rely on complaints from tenants, but tenants are often scared to complain because they fear eviction or they simply don't know about the licensing requirements. There have been cases where councils have collected millions in licensing fees but prosecuted only a handful of landlords for operating without licenses. That doesn't really inspire confidence that the system is working as intended. And when you dig into what the licensing fees are actually being spent on, it gets even murkier. Councils are supposed to use licensing income to fund enforcement and improve standards, but there's often limited transparency about how the money is actually used. Some tenants groups have argued that licensing has become more about revenue generation than genuine improvement. They point to the fact that fees keep going up whilst services don't necessarily improve. It's a fair criticism, even if councils would dispute it. So let's zoom out a bit and think about what all of this means for the UK housing market as a whole. We're in a situation where demand for rental properties massively outstrips supply. There simply aren't enough homes available for all the people who need to rent. Every week, we hear stories about hundreds of people applying for single properties, tenants being outbid by others, offering months of rent up front, families desperate to find somewhere to live. Against this backdrop, anything that reduces supply or increases costs for landlords is going to make things worse for tenants, and licensing, in its current form, does both. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying licensing is inherently bad. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any regulation of private landlords. There are absolutely rogue landlords out there renting out genuinely dangerous properties, and something needs to be done about that. But the way licensing has been implemented, the lack of transparency, the focus on fee collection over enforcement, the expansion without evidence of effectiveness, that's the problem. We've created a system that burdens the majority to catch a minority, and tenants end up paying the price either way. The government has been talking about bringing in a national landlord register and potentially standardising licensing requirements. Some people think this would be better than the current patchwork of different rules in different areas. Others worry it would just add another layer of bureaucracy and cost. Whatever happens, it's clear that the current situation isn't working brilliantly for anyone. Landlords feel over-regulated and undervalued. Tenants face ever-increasing rents and ever-decreasing choices. And councils are stuck trying to manage a system that's grown beyond their capacity to properly administer. So what can you actually do about all this? Whether you're a tenant or a landlord, there are some practical steps. If you're a tenant, first of all, know your rights. Check whether your property should be licensed. You can usually find this information on your council's website. If it should be licensed and isn't, that's something you can raise with the council. In some cases, unlicensed tenants can apply to get some of their rent back through a rent repayment order. If you're concerned about the standards in your property, report it. Councils won't know about problems if nobody tells them. Yes, there are risks, and yes, enforcement is patchy, but you've got a right to live in a safe, decent home. If you're a landlord, make sure you're complying with all the licensing requirements in your area. Check regularly because these things change. Join a landlord association like the NRLA because they'll keep you updated and provide support if you need it. And engage with consultations when they happen. Councils are supposed to consider feedback before introducing or expanding licensing schemes. If landlords don't respond, councils can claim there was no opposition. For everyone, stay informed about what's happening in the housing market. Things are changing constantly, and the more people understand about how the system works, the better equipped we'll all be to push for improvements. Right, so let's wrap this up. What have we learned today? Councils across the UK have been quietly expanding property licensing schemes, often with limited awareness or consultation. These schemes cost landlords significant money, and those costs ultimately get passed on to tenants through higher rents. At the same time, the added burden is pushing some landlords out of the market entirely, which reduces supply and makes the housing crisis worse. Enforcement of licensing is inconsistent, meaning the worst landlords often slip through whilst compliant landlords shoulder the burden. And there are real questions about whether licensing in its current form is actually improving conditions for tenants or just generating revenue for councils. None of this is simple, and there are no easy solutions. But what I hope you take away from this is that these quiet policy changes have real impacts on real people. The housing market isn't just about interest rates and house prices. It's about the rules and regulations that shape how the whole system operates. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. It really does help the channel grow and means we can keep making content like this. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Are licensing schemes a good thing gone wrong? Or were they always a bad idea? Have you been affected by these changes? I'd love to hear your experiences. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.